The story of the Bermuda Triangle doesn't begin with a disappearance. It begins with a series of strange notes in the logbook of the first European to document sailing through these waters, Christopher Columbus. In 1492, as his small fleet crossed the Sargasso Sea, a vast, eerily calm stretch of the Atlantic that would later sit at the heart of the triangle, his entries started to take a strange turn. One night, he wrote that his compass, the most important piece of technology on the ship, began behaving erratically, drifting away from the North Star. A few nights later, he and his crew saw what he called a great flame of fire crash into the ocean in the distance, and on the night before they made landfall, Columbus recorded a flickering light on the horizon, like a little wax candle rising and falling. Today, we can explain most of this. The compass drift was likely caused by natural magnetic variation. The lights may have been torches from people already living on the nearby islands, but to a crew sailing into what, for them, was literally the edge of the world, exhausted, scared, and on the brink of mutiny, these weren't minor glitches. They were omens, the first whispers that something was wrong with this part of the sea. Over a century later, the region got its first truly famous victim. In 1609, the Sea Venture, flagship of a fleet carrying supplies to the struggling English colony at Jamestown, sailed into a brutal hurricane. The ship was torn away from the rest of the fleet and presumed lost. Instead, the crew barely managed to drive the shattered ship onto the reefs of an uninhabited island chain, Bermuda. For sailors, Bermuda already had a reputation. They called it the Isle of Devils because of its storms, dangerous reefs, and eerie sounds from flocks of birds at night. The story of the Sea Venture's wreck and the survivors' struggle was so dramatic that it's believed to have inspired William Shakespeare's final play, The Tempest. Long before anyone coined the term Bermuda Triangle, this corner of the Atlantic was already building a reputation, a place of strange lights, wayward compasses, violent storms, and ships that seemed to sail straight into legend. Before the Bermuda Triangle even had a name, one mystery on the open ocean set the template for every ghost ship story to come. In December 1872, a British vessel in the Atlantic spotted a ship drifting aimlessly. It was the Mary Celeste, a merchant brigantine that had left New York a month earlier, bound for Italy. Up close, everything looked normal. The ship was seaworthy, her sails were set, her cargo of industrial alcohol was untouched. There was enough food and water in the hold to last 6 months, but there wasn't a single person on board. The crew's belongings were still in their quarters. The ship's logbook had a final entry from 10 days earlier, with no sign of trouble. The only thing missing was the one lifeboat and the 10 people who had been sailing her, including the captain, his wife, and their 2-year-old daughter. They had simply vanished. News of the Mary Celeste exploded around the world. Newspapers and storytellers rushed in with theories: pirates, mutiny, sea monsters, even attacks from something not of this earth. The most likely explanation is far less supernatural. Fumes from the cargo of alcohol may have threatened to explode, causing the captain to order a temporary evacuation into the lifeboat. The line connecting them to the ship may have snapped, leaving them stranded in the open ocean. But no one knows for sure. What mattered is this: the ship was real, the people were real, and yet the ocean had turned them into a ghost story. From that point on, the idea of an empty ship drifting through the Atlantic, its crew swallowed without a trace, was burned into the public imagination. A story pattern the Bermuda Triangle would later fit perfectly. In the 20th century, a series of catastrophic and baffling disappearances laid the foundation for the modern Bermuda Triangle legend. The first and biggest was the case of the USS Cyclops. In March 1918, this colossal Navy collier, over 540 feet long, carrying more than 300 men and a heavy cargo of manganese ore, vanished somewhere between Barbados and Baltimore. There was no storm, no distress call. An extensive search found nothing. Not a lifeboat, not a piece of debris, not a single body. One newspaper wrote that it was as though some gigantic monster of the sea had grabbed her, men and all. The loss of the Cyclops remains the single largest loss of life in U.S. naval history, not caused by combat. And the mystery only deepened when two of her sister ships, the Proteus and the Nereus, disappeared along similar routes in 1941. These military tragedies established the pattern of baffling naval disappearance. But the event that truly branded this region into the public imagination happened on December 5, 1945. 5 U.S. Navy Avenger torpedo bombers, a squadron known as Flight 19, took off from Fort Lauderdale, Florida, for a routine 2-hour training mission. The pilots were experienced. The weather was clear. 90 minutes into the flight, the control tower received a chilling message from the flight leader, Lieutenant Charles Taylor. He was disoriented. His compasses were malfunctioning. He thought he was over the Florida Keys, but he wasn't sure. For the next 2 hours, ground control listened as the pilots of Flight 19 flew in confused circles, their voices growing more anxious as fuel ran low. The last transmission heard from the squadron was a desperate message from one pilot to another. "It looks like we are entering white water. We're completely lost." The 5 planes and the 14 men aboard them were never seen again. The tragedy was compounded that same night when a Martin Mariner rescue plane, sent out with a crew of 13 to search for Flight 19, also vanished. It too disappeared without a trace. A massive week-long air and sea search, one of the largest in history, found nothing. The official Navy report was blunt and baffled. It concluded that it was as if they had flown to Mars. The events, the Cyclops, Flight 19, were all real, tragic, and genuinely mysterious. But they were seen as separate, isolated incidents. The idea that they were all connected, part of a sinister pattern centered on a specific geographical area, was an invention. It was the brainchild of pulp writers in the 1950s and 60s. The very first person to connect the dots and draw a triangle was an American author named Vincent Gaddis. In a 1964 article for Argosy magazine, a men's adventure pulp, he mapped out the disappearances, drew 3 lines connecting Bermuda, Florida, and Puerto Rico, and gave the phenomenon its iconic name, the deadly Bermuda Triangle. But the man who turned this fringe idea into a global phenomenon was Charles Berlitz. In 1974, he published a book simply titled The Bermuda Triangle. It was a slick mix of real incidents and wild speculation, and it exploded. The book sold over 20 million copies worldwide. Berlitz took a small set of genuine mysteries and padded them with dozens of other cases, some distorted, some exaggerated, some almost certainly made up. Then he wrapped them in a buffet of paranormal explanations. Was the triangle a hunting ground for aliens, abducting humans for study? Was it powered by a crystal from Atlantis, buried on the seafloor and warping time and space? Or was it a portal to another dimension, swallowing ships and planes whole? It was nonsense as science. but it was fantastic storytelling, and it landed at the perfect moment. The 1970s were a decade of deep mistrust of official explanations and a golden age for conspiracy theories, UFOs, and the paranormal. Into that mood walked the Bermuda Triangle, a ready-made, terrifying mystery that seemed to prove there were still places on Earth where science simply failed. In the end, it wasn't a Navy admiral or a genius scientist who went after the Bermuda Triangle, it was a librarian. In 1975, a reference librarian named Larry Kusche decided to do something almost no one else had bothered with. Actually check the original records. He spent years digging through official Navy reports, newspaper archives, and weather data. The result was a book titled The Bermuda Triangle Mystery, Solved, and it was brutal. Kusche found that Charles Berlitz and other triangle authors weren't just sloppy, they were master storytellers who willfully ignored any fact that got in the way of a good mystery. Many of the mysterious disappearances happened during massive storms that Berlitz simply never mentioned. Others took place hundreds of miles outside the so-called triangle. Some ships and planes that were said to have vanished without a trace had actually arrived safely. Their safe arrival was just ignored because it ruined the story. One yacht Berlitz listed as a victim of the triangle. It turned up safely in port a few days after it was reported missing. And then there's Flight 19. Remember how the legend says the Navy was baffled, that the planes just flew into some supernatural void? Kusche found the official report says something far simpler and much sadder. The Navy concluded that the flight leader, Lieutenant Charles Taylor, had a history of getting lost. On that day, he likely mistook the Bahamas for the Florida Keys. Against the advice of his own men, he led the squadron farther and farther out into the open Atlantic until their fuel ran out. As for the rescue plane that also vanished without a trace, that one wasn't a mystery at all. It was a Martin Mariner, an aircraft so prone to fuel leaks it was nicknamed the flying gas tank. Multiple ships in the area reported seeing a huge fireball in the sky at the exact time and place the plane disappeared. It didn't slip into another dimension. It exploded. Piece by piece, Kusche showed that the Bermuda Triangle wasn't some hole in the laws of physics. It was something much more familiar, a handful of real tragedies wrapped in exaggerations, omissions, and outright inventions, and sold to the world as a paranormal mystery. So if there are no aliens, no portals, no gateways to other dimensions, is there anything special about the Bermuda Triangle? Yes, not in a paranormal way, but in geographical and meteorological dangerous ways. First, the weather. The triangle sits right in Hurricane Alley, one of the most violent weather corridors on Earth. Warm water-fueled storms that can explode into life in a matter of hours. A ship can leave harbor under blue skies and by afternoon be fighting for its life in a sudden, raging storm. Then there's the ocean itself. The Gulf Stream, a massive, fast-moving current, cuts straight through the region like a river in the sea. It can push ships and planes hundreds of miles off course and scatter any wreckage almost instantly. Combine that with deep ocean trenches and steep drop-offs, and debris doesn't just sink. It vanishes into thousands of feet of black water where recovery is nearly impossible. Beneath that, the seafloor is anything but calm. This part of the Atlantic is scarred with canyons, underwater mountains, and deposits of frozen methane trapped in the sediments. Some scientists have suggested that sudden releases of this gas could briefly turn patches of ocean into a deadly foam, robbing a ship of its buoyancy so quickly it goes down before anyone can react. It's rare and debated, but it shows how unforgiving this geology can be. And then there's the ocean's most brutal party trick: rogue waves. For centuries, sailors spoke of impossible walls of water that appeared out of nowhere and ripped ships apart. In 1995, instruments on the Draupner oil platform in the North Sea finally proved them right, recording a single wave over 80 feet high, rising from much smaller seas. We now know these freak waves can form when multiple wave systems line up and briefly combine their power. In a place like the Bermuda Triangle, where powerful currents, storm systems, and shifting winds collide, the conditions for such monsters are unusually good. Put it all together: sudden storms, powerful currents, deep waters, unstable seabeds, and rare but deadly rogue waves, and the triangle stops looking like a supernatural trap and starts looking like what it really is: one of the harshest, most unforgiving stretches of busy ocean anywhere on Earth. The Bermuda Triangle isn't the only so-called vile vortex on the map. On the other side of the planet, off the coast of Japan, lies its Pacific counterpart, the Devil's Sea, or Dragon's Triangle. For decades, it's had a similar reputation: a patch of ocean that swallows ships and planes. In 1952, the Japanese government even sent a research vessel, the Kiyomaru No. 5, to investigate the disappearances. The ship, along with its 31 crew members, vanished. After that, the area was officially labeled a maritime danger zone. But just like the Bermuda Triangle, the Devil's Sea isn't paranormal. It sits on the Pacific Ring of Fire, one of the most geologically violent regions on Earth. Underwater volcanoes, earthquakes, and the tsunamis they trigger can wipe out ships with almost no warning. Powerful currents collide here, and the region is regularly smashed by typhoons. The lesson is clear: the Bermuda Triangle is not a unique phenomenon. It is part of a global pattern of how humans create myths and legends to explain the very real and terrifying dangers of the natural world. So where does that leave us? The Bermuda Triangle is not a place where the laws of physics break down. It's a place where they're on full, brutal display. It is a region with a high volume of traffic, a history of powerful hurricanes, a treacherous and deep ocean floor, and unique magnetic quirks. When you combine all of these real, scientifically verifiable dangers, it's not surprising that ships and planes have met tragic ends here. What's really interesting isn't the disappearances themselves. It's our reaction to them. The data from the US Coast Guard and maritime insurers is clear. When you look at it percentage-wise, the Bermuda Triangle loses no more ships or planes than any other heavily trafficked, storm-prone part of the ocean. There is no statistical anomaly, no hotspot of doom, just risk scaled up by traffic and weather. In the end, the Bermuda Triangle is less a place on the map and more a place in our minds. It's a story about us, about how badly we want patterns in chaos, how quick we are to turn tragedy into legend, and how comforting it can feel to blame the unknown on aliens, Atlantis, or portals, instead of on bad luck, bad weather, and bad decisions. Of all the real dangers in the Bermuda Triangle, which do you find the most compelling? The violent weather, the treacherous Gulf Stream, or the potential for methane blowouts? Share your thoughts in the comments below. To untangle more of the world's greatest myths and mysteries, subscribe to World Untangled and join us for our next deep dive.